Did your grandma ever share the secrets big supermarkets never wanted you to know? These everyday tricks stretched every dollar and kept food fresh in ways stores wouldn't say. What else have we lost by not listening? Buying day-old bread from the bakery back door was one of those quiet little secrets Grandma swore by. The bread was perfectly fine, still soft and fresh enough to make sandwiches, but it was sold at a fraction of the cost simply because it had sat on the shelf for a single day. She would walk straight to the back, where the bakers knew her name, and they would hand over brown paper bags filled with loaves, rolls, and even the occasional sweet bun. The supermarkets never told people about this because they wanted them to buy at full price, even if it meant throwing out yesterday's stock. Grandma knew better than to waste money on a loaf just for the sake of the label saying fresh. If anything, she liked day-old bread better for making toast or French toast because it held up without turning soggy. She would often freeze half of it to use later in the week, which meant she could stretch that tiny bit of grocery money much further. This little habit was part frugality, part stubbornness, and completely effective, and it is exactly the kind of wisdom that has quietly disappeared from modern shopping. Free soup bones from the butcher were a treasure Grandma never passed up. Back then, many butchers considered them scraps and gave them away to regular customers. No charge at all. She would ask for them with a smile, and the butcher would often toss in a few marrow-rich pieces or meaty ends that could turn a simple pot of water into something hearty and filling. The supermarkets hated this kind of thing because it meant you could create a flavorful, nutrient-packed soup without buying prepackaged broth or pricey cuts of meat. Grandma knew the value of slow simmering those bones with onions, carrots, celery, and whatever herbs she had growing in the garden. The aroma would fill the house, and by the time the broth was done, it was rich enough to be a meal on its own. Sometimes she would freeze it in old jars to use in gravies, stews, or casseroles later on. What was once considered a free throwaway item is now something you have to pay good money for in stores. But for Grandma, it was simply one more way to keep the pantry stocked without spending a dime. Seasonal bulk buying at farm stands was how Grandma made sure the family always had good food all year without paying supermarket prices. She would wait until the peak of harvest when the farmers had more produce than they could store and prices dropped fast. Then she would buy bushels of tomatoes, peaches, corn, or beans, taking them home in the back of the car. The work started right away, washing, blanching, canning, and sometimes freezing so nothing went to waste. Supermarkets could not compete with the freshness or the price, and they certainly did not want people to know how much cheaper it was to buy direct from the source. It was long, hot work in the kitchen, but it paid off when she could open a jar of tomatoes in the middle of winter and taste the summer sun in every bite. Those shelves lined with jars were like a personal grocery store, except she had stocked it herself for pennies on the dollar. The pride in knowing she had provided for the family that way was just as satisfying as the savings, and it is a tradition worth remembering. Using fabric feed sacks for clothing was one of those ingenious habits born out of necessity. The feed for chickens or livestock often came in sturdy cotton sacks, and Grandma saw no reason to throw perfectly good material away. She would wash the fabric, cut it into pieces, and turn it into aprons, pillowcases, and even dresses for the children. Over time, companies caught on and started printing the sacks with floral or checkered patterns, knowing housewives like her would reuse them. The supermarkets and clothing stores did not want people to keep up with habits like this because it meant fewer purchases of new linens or garments. Grandma's sewing machine was always busy, humming away as she turned what others might see as trash into something useful and often beautiful. The fabric was strong, washable, and free, which made it a win in every possible way. Today, you can buy replicas for high prices at specialty shops, but back then, it was just part of being practical and making the most of every resource. Saving bacon grease in a coffee can was second nature to Grandma, and it was not just for frying eggs. Whenever bacon was cooked, she would carefully pour the rendered fat into an old tin kept on the back of the stove. Once cooled, it became a flavorful, ready-to-use fat for cooking vegetables, making biscuits, or seasoning cast-iron pans. It was a way of adding richness without using store-bought oils or butter, which could be expensive or hard to come by. Supermarkets did not encourage habits like this because they wanted you to keep buying more cooking fats instead of reusing what you already had. The smell of onions frying in a spoonful of bacon grease was enough to make the whole kitchen feel warm and inviting. She swore it made cornbread taste better and greens taste richer. It was about thrift, but it was also about flavor, and nothing you can buy in a jar today comes close to the depth that little can of bacon grease brought to her cooking. Trading eggs with neighbors was more than just a way to save money. It was community in action. If Grandma's hens laid more than the family could eat, she would swap the extras for milk, butter, or fresh vegetables from a neighbor's garden. No cash changed hands, and everyone went home with something they needed. It kept grocery costs down and ensured the food was fresh and often better than anything sold in stores. Supermarkets thrived on the idea that everyone should buy what they needed separately, but in Grandma's world, sharing made more sense. These little trades built trust and friendships that lasted for years. She always said the best meals came from ingredients that had been grown or raised by someone you knew, and she was right. You cannot put a price on the satisfaction of making dinner from food you got through kindness and cooperation rather than a checkout line. Knowing which day the butcher marked down meat was a secret worth guarding. Grandma paid attention, asked the right questions, and learned exactly when cuts of meat would get a lower price before new stock came in. That was the day she would be at the counter early, picking the best of the discounted selection before anyone else. These were still quality cuts, often just one day closer to their sell-by date, and perfect for cooking right away or freezing. The supermarkets never advertised this because it meant selling meat for less instead of full price. She would plan her week's meals around what she found on those markdown days, making hearty stews, roasts, and meat pies without straining the budget. It was a small act of strategy, but it added up to huge savings over the years. This kind of quiet observation is something we have lost in the era of prepackaged everything, but back then it was just smart shopping. Stretching coffee grounds twice might sound like cutting corners, but Grandma swore the second pot was still worth drinking. She would brew her morning coffee, set the used grounds aside, and later add a little fresh coffee to them before brewing again. The result was a slightly lighter cup, but it still had enough flavor to satisfy without doubling the cost. Coffee was once a luxury, and wasting it was out of the question. The coffee companies wanted people to brew strong cups and throw the grounds away so they would buy more, but Grandma knew better. She would even save the cooled coffee for baking recipes that called for a bit of liquid and a hint of bitterness, like chocolate cakes. Every bit of the bag was used up, and no one in the house felt deprived. This was frugality with a dash of quiet rebellion, and it made her kitchen run on her terms instead of the store's. Growing kitchen herbs on the windowsill was how Grandma avoided the high prices of dried spices in the store. A sunny spot in the kitchen became home to pots of basil, parsley, thyme, and chives. Fresh herbs made every meal taste brighter, and there was no need to pay for tiny jars of seasoning that lost their flavor too quickly. She would snip just what she needed, rinse it, and drop it straight into the pot, letting the aroma fill the air. Supermarkets preferred selling packaged herbs at a premium, but for Grandma, growing them was easier, cheaper, and more satisfying. Sometimes she would dry the extra leaves and store them in glass jars for winter use. Those little pots were like a living spice rack, and they kept her meals tasting fresh all year long. It was a small effort with a big payoff, and one that gave her a sense of independence every time she cooked. Making stock from vegetable scraps was Grandma's way of turning what most people threw out into liquid gold. Onion skins, carrot ends, celery leaves, and even herb stems went into a bag in the icebox until there was enough to simmer into a rich broth. She never saw the point of buying cartons of stock when the makings for it were already in her kitchen. Supermarkets counted on people not realizing how easy it was to create something so flavorful for free. The pot would bubble away for hours, filling the house with a comforting smell, and then she would strain and store the broth in jars. It became the base for soups, gravies, and casseroles, adding depth without costing a cent. Nothing was wasted, and everything tasted better because of it. That habit taught everyone in the house that value could be found in the smallest, most overlooked things, and it is a lesson still worth learning today. Canning tomatoes at home was one of Grandma's biggest money-saving rituals. Every summer, she would wait for the peak of the tomato harvest when the price dropped and the flavor was at its best. She would spend hours blanching, peeling, and simmering them before packing the jars tightly and sealing them for the pantry. It was a hot, messy job, but the reward came in winter when store prices for tomatoes doubled and the flavor was bland compared to her bright, home-preserved jars. She knew that by canning enough at once, she could have a supply for sauces, soups, and casseroles without ever paying the inflated supermarket price. The shelves lined with neatly labeled jars were a point of pride and a reminder that preparation paid off. Supermarkets could not profit from customers like her, which is exactly why they never encouraged home canning. The rich red jars were like little bits of summer saved for a cold day, and each one was proof that she was in control of her kitchen instead of letting the store dictate the menu or the budget. Storing potatoes in the cellar with apples was a trick Grandma swore by to keep them from sprouting for months. The cool, dark space of the cellar was already perfect for preserving root vegetables, but the apples added something extra. They released small amounts of ethylene gas, which slowed the sprouting process in the potatoes. This meant she could buy large sacks when they were cheapest and still have them in good condition well into the winter. The supermarkets did not want people to know this because it allowed families to skip frequent trips for fresh potatoes, cutting down on impulse buys. She would place the apples in small baskets around the sacks, checking them every so often to remove any that had started to go soft. It was a low-effort, no-cost method that made a big difference in keeping the pantry stocked. When you live through times when every penny counts, tricks like this become second nature, and Grandma treated it like common sense. Today, most people rely on short-term storage, but her method gave her a steady supply no matter the season. Using vinegar as a multi-purpose cleaner was another way Grandma kept the household running without falling for supermarket marketing. She would buy large jugs of plain white vinegar for pennies compared to the brightly labeled bottles of specialty cleaners. With a little water and sometimes a squeeze of lemon, it could clean windows, countertops, floors, and even remove stubborn odors. It was safe to use around food, unlike harsh chemical sprays, and it did not leave behind the heavy scents that brand-name products use to feel more premium. The supermarkets and cleaning product companies never liked the fact that something so cheap and simple could do the job just as well, if not better. Grandma kept a spray bottle under the sink that she would refill over and over, never paying for a new container or falling for a new scent. She knew that cleaning was about results, not fancy packaging, and vinegar delivered every time. Even laundry benefited from a splash in the rinse cycle to soften clothes naturally. For her, it was less about being frugal for the sake of it and more about using what worked best. Shopping right before closing time was one of Grandma's clever ways to get steep discounts without clipping a single coupon. She knew that perishable items like bread, dairy, and produce had to be marked down at the end of the day to make room for fresh stock. Just before the lights dimmed and the staff started sweeping, she would walk in and head straight for the clearance section. The deals were not advertised, and the best items were gone fast, but with a little persistence, she often left with bags full of food for a fraction of the price. Supermarkets counted on most shoppers coming in during peak hours, paying full price for convenience, but Grandma turned the schedule in her favor. Some nights, she would get whole loaves of bread, cuts of meat, or fresh vegetables that would last for days. If something was close to its sell-by date, she would cook or freeze it right away. It was a habit built on timing, observation, and patience, and it let her stretch the grocery budget without ever feeling like she was going without. Cooking end cuts from the deli was one of Grandma's favorite ways to turn scraps into something delicious. The deli counters would slice meat and cheese for customers, and the ends left behind were too small to sell at full price. Many times the store would wrap them up and sell them cheaply, or even give them away to regulars who knew to ask. These odd-shaped pieces were perfect for chopping into omelets, casseroles, or sandwiches. Grandma loved the variety, since no two batches of end cuts were ever exactly the same. The supermarkets never promoted this option because it meant selling the same product for less. But for her, it was like getting the premium flavors without the premium cost. She would keep a small container in the fridge just for these odds and ends, ready to toss into whatever was cooking that day. It was frugal, yes, but also creative, because it encouraged her to make meals based on what she had instead of what was on a list. This habit proved that with the right approach, scraps could be the best part of the meal. Making butter from whipping cream on sale was Grandma's way of turning a bargain into something even more valuable. Whenever the cream was marked down, often because it was close to its sell-by date, she would buy as much as she could carry. Back home, she would churn it by hand or in a mixer until the golden butter separated from the buttermilk. The supermarkets wanted people to think butter came only in neat little wrapped blocks, but she knew how simple it was to make it herself. The fresh butter had a richness that store-bought versions could not match, and the leftover buttermilk was perfect for baking biscuits or pancakes. It was like getting two products for the price of one. Sometimes she would salt the butter for longer storage or shape it into small patties to freeze for later. The whole process took less than half an hour and turned a simple discount into weeks of high-quality cooking fat. It was another reminder that knowing how to do something yourself is worth far more than any brand could sell you. Knowing when to skip name brands was an unspoken skill Grandma perfected over decades. She could spot the store brand items that were identical to the premium versions just by looking at the packaging and ingredients list. Many were made in the same factories, just with a different label, but sold for much less. Supermarkets relied on customers assuming the pricier item was somehow better, but she knew not to fall for it. She would test each product once, and if it passed her standards, it became the go-to choice. From pantry staples like flour and sugar to cleaning products and canned goods, she often paid half the price without sacrificing quality. The money saved went toward other essentials or sometimes just stayed in her pocket. This habit was less about being cheap and more about refusing to pay for marketing when the product inside was the same. It took a keen eye and a willingness to try something new, but it was one of the simplest ways she stayed ahead of the game. Turning stale bread into croutons or stuffing was one of Grandma's easy ways to make sure nothing in the kitchen went to waste. Bread that had gone a little dry was perfect for cutting into cubes, tossing with oil and herbs, and baking until golden and crisp. These croutons added crunch to salads or soups, and they kept for weeks in a jar. For stuffing, she would cube the bread, mix it with onions, celery, and broth, and bake it into a hearty side dish. Supermarkets wanted you to throw out stale bread and buy new, but Grandma saw it as an ingredient waiting for its next purpose. She often bought day-old bread just for this reason, paying pennies for what others overlooked. The result was flavorful, filling, and cost almost nothing. It was a habit that combined frugality with creativity, proving that freshness is not the only measure of a good ingredient. In her kitchen, every slice had a second life, and nothing edible was ever wasted if she could help it. Buying in glass jars to reuse for storage was a subtle way Grandma avoided paying for extra containers. She would choose certain products, like sauces, jams, or pickles, not just for the food inside, but for the sturdy jar it came in. Once cleaned, these jars became storage for dried herbs, beans, rice, or homemade preserves. Over time, she built a matching set without spending a cent on fancy canisters. The supermarket sold decorative storage jars for high prices, but she knew those grocery purchases could serve two purposes. The reusability of glass meant less waste, and it was far safer for long-term food storage than plastic. Labels peeled off with a little soaking, and sometimes she would decorate the lids with scraps of fabric or paint. Each jar in her cupboard had been earned twice, once for the food it held, and again for the use it gave after. This was the kind of quiet efficiency that kept her kitchen organized without ever buying into trends. Roasting bones after Sunday dinner for soup was Grandma's way of making every bit of a meal count. After carving a roast chicken or beef, she would save the bones, pop them in the oven to deepen the flavor, and then simmer them into a rich broth. This stock became the base for soups, stews, and sauces during the week, stretching the value of that single meal far beyond one night. Supermarkets sold ready-made stock, but nothing compared to the depth of flavor from bones roasted in her own oven. It was a slow process, but it filled the house with an aroma that promised good eating ahead. Sometimes she would freeze the broth in small portions so it was always ready for quick meals. This habit meant less food waste, more flavor, and savings that added up over time. It was kitchen thrift at its finest, turning what many would throw away into the heart of another meal entirely. Using a root cellar instead of refrigeration was one of Grandma's simplest ways to save on electricity while keeping food fresh longer. The cool, dark environment slowed spoilage for root vegetables, apples, and even jars of preserves without the need for constant power. She would arrange baskets of potatoes, carrots, onions, and beets in neat rows, checking them regularly for any signs of decay. The temperature stayed steady, and the air circulation kept everything from turning too quickly. Supermarkets and appliance companies preferred customers to rely on refrigerators because it encouraged more frequent shopping. For Grandma, the cellar was a built-in pantry that let her store seasonal harvests for months, avoiding the inflated prices of out-of-season produce. It was self-sufficiency at its best, allowing her to keep food on hand without extra costs. Even in summer, the cellar remained cooler than the rest of the house, making it a reliable storage option. It might seem old-fashioned now, but for her, it was the kind of common-sense solution that made a big difference to the household budget. Making jelly from apple peels and cores was Grandma's way of turning kitchen scraps into something sweet and worth sharing. After making pies or applesauce, she would collect the leftover peels and cores, simmer them slowly with water and sugar, and strain the liquid into jars. The result was a light, flavorful jelly that cost almost nothing and kept for months. It made perfect use of what most people threw away without thinking. The supermarkets relied on customers buying jars of fruit preserves at full price, but Grandma's method cut that expense entirely. She often flavored her jelly with cinnamon or cloves, giving it a homemade touch that store-bought versions could not match. It was a patient process, but it meant nothing went to waste, and there was always something sweet to spread on bread or toast. Every time she opened a jar, it was proof that thrift and creativity could be just as satisfying as luxury. Buying whole chickens instead of parts was a habit Grandma knew would stretch her dollar further. She could roast the bird for a Sunday meal, save the leftover meat for sandwiches or casseroles, and use the bones to make stock. Buying pre-cut chicken parts cost more because of the extra processing, something supermarkets encouraged for convenience. At home, she had the tools and the know-how to break down a bird herself, packaging the portions just the way she liked. It gave her more meals for less money and ensured nothing was wasted. The wings might be saved for a quick fry, while the thighs went into a stew and the breasts into a salad. Even the skin was crisped for an extra treat. This approach was about more than just savings. It gave her control over the quality and variety of the meals she served. It was proof that a little extra work could make the grocery budget go much further. Hanging clothes to dry was as much about preserving the fabric as it was about saving money on the laundromat or electric dryer. Grandma would carry baskets of wet laundry outside, pinning them carefully on the line so the sun and breeze could do the work. The fresh air left everything smelling clean without any added products, and there was no risk of shrinking delicate fabrics. Supermarkets and appliance companies promoted dryers as modern conveniences, but Grandma knew they wore out clothes faster. By air drying, she kept garments in good condition for years, which meant fewer trips to buy replacements. On rainy days, she would string lines indoors, turning part of the house into a drying space. It was slower, but it cost nothing, and the results were worth the effort. For her, it was simply part of the household routine, and it worked as well then as it would today. Stretching ground beef with oats or rice was Grandma's way of making meat last longer without anyone noticing. She would mix in cooked rice or rolled oats before forming patties or shaping meatloaf, and the flavor stayed rich while the texture remained satisfying. This cut the cost of each serving and allowed her to feed more people with the same amount of meat. The supermarkets preferred customers to buy more meat rather than use fillers, but Grandma's method kept her grocery bill in check. It was especially useful during times when meat prices spiked or availability was limited. The added grains absorbed the juices, making the dish moist and hearty. No one complained about the change, and in many cases they asked for seconds. This small adjustment added up to big savings over the course of a year, proving that careful planning in the kitchen could make a real difference. Using lard instead of shortening was a choice Grandma made for both flavor and frugality. Rendered from pork fat, lard could be made at home or bought inexpensively, and it gave pies, biscuits, and fried foods a taste that store-bought shortening could not match. Supermarkets and brands pushed shortening heavily because it was a packaged product with a high profit margin, but lard was the traditional choice for generations. Grandma often saved the fat from cooking and rendered it herself, storing it in jars for later use. It was versatile, lasting for weeks without spoiling, and it made her baked goods tender and flavorful. Using lard also meant less waste since every part of the animal was put to use. For her, it was a practical decision that also happened to improve the quality of her cooking, something no advertisement could convince her to change. Making salad dressings from pantry staples was a habit that saved money and kept flavors fresh. Grandma rarely bought bottled dressings, knowing she could whip up something in minutes using vinegar, oil, mustard, and herbs. The supermarkets stocked shelves with dozens of varieties, all marked up for the sake of convenience, but she preferred her own creations. She adjusted the ingredients depending on the meal, sometimes adding honey for sweetness or garlic for a sharper bite. The dressings were made in small batches so nothing went to waste, and they could be customized to suit any taste. This approach also meant fewer additives and preservatives compared to store-bought versions. It was another example of how a little know-how in the kitchen could replace a product that was marketed as essential. For Grandma, it was not just about the savings, it was about knowing exactly what went into her food. Saving and reusing wax paper from cereal boxes was Grandma's way of getting free, durable wrapping material. She would carefully pull it from the box, wash it if necessary, and fold it away for later use. This waxed lining was perfect for wrapping sandwiches, covering dough, or storing baked goods without sticking. The supermarkets never encouraged this because it meant customers bought fewer rolls of plastic wrap or foil. The paper was strong enough to be used multiple times, and it came at no extra cost. It was a small habit that added up to consistent savings and less waste. In a time when every household item had to be stretched, even packaging became part of the resource pool. For her, it was just another example of not letting anything go unused. Keeping a price book was one of Grandma's most reliable tools for spotting a true bargain when she saw it. She carefully wrote down the cost of staples like flour, sugar, beans, and coffee at different stores, along with the date and any sale details. Over time, this little notebook revealed patterns. She could tell exactly when a store would mark down canned goods or offer a real discount on butter. Supermarkets counted on customers assuming a bright sale sign meant savings, but her records proved that was often not the case. If the price was only a penny or two less than normal, she left it on the shelf, knowing a deeper cut was coming soon. This system helped her buy in bulk when prices hit their lowest and skip buying when they were artificially high. It was a low-effort habit that gave her control over her spending instead of letting the store's marketing decide for her. Even years later, she could recite the going rate for everyday items from memory, a testament to how discipline and attention to detail could make the grocery budget stretch much further. Freezing milk before it spoiled was a quiet trick Grandma relied on to make sure not a single drop went to waste. If she spotted a sale or saw that a carton was close to its expiration date, she would pour the milk into smaller containers, leaving a bit of space at the top for expansion, and place them in the freezer. When needed, she thawed them slowly in the refrigerator, then used the milk for baking, cooking, or even drinking if it was still fresh tasting. This simple method meant she could take advantage of bulk discounts without worrying about spoilage, something supermarkets would never encourage because it reduced the number of trips customers made to restock. It also came in handy during bad weather or busy weeks when getting to the store was difficult. Freezing extended the life of milk by weeks beyond its printed date, and once thawed, it was perfectly fine for most uses. For Grandma, it was just one more example of making every purchase work harder, proving that a little foresight could keep the kitchen stocked and the budget under control year-round. Roasting a whole onion used to be a meal in itself. Simple, hearty, and full of slow-cooked comfort. You did not need olive oil or a rack of spices. Just toss an unpeeled onion into the oven or tuck it into the coals of a fire and wait. Slowly, the inside softened, caramelized, and turned sweet, while the outer skin blackened and protected the flavor. Peel it at the table, sprinkle on salt or butter if you had it, and eat it straight from the foil or plate. For families with barely a potato left, this was a warm, filling side that required nothing but time. Onions were cheap, stored well, and brought out a kind of earthy richness when roasted whole. They could anchor a meal or stretch a small portion of meat. Today, most people roast vegetables in glossy pans with elaborate glazes, but this was bare-bones cooking, and it worked. Grocery stores rarely mention how much flavor lives in the simplest things when left alone. Roasting onions this way was a kind of quiet ritual, one that filled kitchens with warmth and made even a root vegetable feel like something special. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Scrap-fried hash was the kind of meal that told you exactly how your week had gone, by what ended up in the pan. Families would take the odds and ends from dinner all week long: bits of meat, soft vegetables, maybe a few spoonfuls of rice or beans, and toss them into a skillet with grease and onion. Fried together, pressed down, and turned crisp, it became something new. Not quite a stew, not quite a cake, just a hash. You never made it the same way twice, but somehow it always came out tasting like something more than the sum of its parts. Some households planned for it, saving their scraps carefully in a tin. Others pulled it together on nights when there was not enough of any one thing. It was salty, savory, and always hot. You could stretch it with potatoes, bulk it out with gravy, or stuff it in bread and call it a sandwich. What mattered was that it filled plates and kept everyone quiet for a while. Scrap-fried hash was not just thrifty, it was practical hope on a plate. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Mock foods were some of the most creative tricks to ever come out of a humble kitchen. These were recipes made to look and taste like the real thing, without using any of the expensive ingredients. Mock apple pie was one of the most famous, made with Ritz crackers, sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice instead of apples. It sounds odd, but once baked, it fooled even the sharpest tongue. There was mock duck made from seasoned wheat gluten, shaped and browned to mimic roasted meat. Mock sausages were mashed beans with spices, shaped and pan-fried. These ideas were born during rationing, when people could not get their hands on sugar, meat, or fresh produce. Instead of going without, they got inventive. These mock dishes were not just substitutions, they were proud declarations that dinner was still happening. Grocery stores today sell imitation foods, but they lack the honesty and ingenuity of these original versions. This was not factory deception. It was resourcefulness, straight from a home cook doing their best. Homemade rennet for cheesemaking was not for the faint of heart, but it got the job done. Before tablets and store-bought cultures, people used what they had, often vinegar, lemon juice, or for the brave ones, a bit of calf stomach lining. The process was part science, part tradition. You warmed milk gently, stirred in the curdling agent, and waited for the magic to happen. Once it separated into curds and whey, you strained it through cloth and pressed it into soft rounds or blocks. Some added salt or herbs, others kept it plain. The taste was fresh, a little tangy, and deeply rewarding. It was not just about saving money, it was about knowing how to make food from the ground up. Today's cookbooks mostly skip this, expecting readers to start with pre-made cheese or kits. But the old method taught patience and respect for the process. Cheese was no longer something you bought, it was something you made. Apple skin tea was what you made when even the scraps had scraps. In homes where nothing went to waste, apple peels left over from canning or pie making were gathered and boiled into a weak but fragrant tea. It smelled sweet like cider, even if the taste was faint. Sometimes people added cinnamon sticks or cloves, but most of the time it was just water and skins. Served hot, it warmed your hands and gave you the sense that you were drinking something more than water. In a time when every ingredient had to pull double duty, this was how you honored what little you had. Apple skin tea was often sipped at night after supper when the fire had burned low and the day's work was done. It was not about nourishment so much as comfort. A hot mug of anything in the Great Depression was an act of care. You felt it going down, slow and steady, and it reminded you that sweetness could still be coaxed from the barest leftovers. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Baking whole cloves in a dish inside the oven did more than scent the kitchen. It calmed the whole house. You did not need candles or sprays, just a few tablespoons of cloves, sometimes mixed with cinnamon sticks or orange peels, placed in an oven-safe dish and warmed on low heat. As the oven warmed the spices, the aroma would drift into every corner. It was rich, warm, and far more comforting than anything store-bought. This trick was often used before company came over, during the holidays, or just to lift a heavy mood. For families living through lean times, scent mattered more than people think. It made a plain house feel full, even when the pantry was not. And it masked the smell of stronger meals like cabbage, salt pork, or liver. Supermarkets now sell air fresheners that try to imitate this very thing, but they miss the warmth. Back then, a good-smelling house came from what you cooked, not what you sprayed. Skillet roasting coffee beans at home was an act of love and patience. Before electric roasters and fancy blends, families would buy green coffee beans in bulk and roast them right in their kitchens. A heavy cast-iron skillet was all you needed. You kept the beans moving constantly to prevent burning, usually shaking the pan or stirring with a long spoon over medium heat. The smell was smoky, earthy, and almost intoxicating. You had to listen closely for the first crack, that sharp popping sound that told you the roast was beginning. Some people liked a lighter roast, others waited for a darker color and fuller aroma. Once cooled, sometimes wrapped in a damp towel, they were ground by hand or in a manual grinder and brewed fresh. It was a whole process, but it made your morning cup feel earned. Today's coffee comes pre-roasted, pre-ground, and sealed in plastic. But back then, roasting your own beans was a skill that saved money, deepened flavor, and filled the house with the kind of smell that told you the day was starting right. Gravy over rice might sound like a side dish today, but in the 1930s, it was often the main event. When meat was scarce and vegetables were few, the leftover drippings from a roast, or even just some bacon grease and flour, got turned into gravy. Pour that over a pot of plain boiled rice, and suddenly you had dinner. It was salty, it was filling, and it used things that might otherwise go to waste. Gravy made even the blandest starch taste rich, and rice was a cheap staple that went a long way. Families would keep jars of fat and reuse every spoonful, sometimes adding a splash of milk or a bit of onion for extra depth. It was not about variety, it was about sustenance. One bowl of this could keep you full through a whole day's work, and that was all anyone hoped for. Some children grew up thinking this was a real meal, not realizing it was born of necessity. It was practical, thrifty, and as comforting as it was humbling. You did not need a feast. You just needed something hot, salty, and spoonable. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Cereal box liners used to have a second life long after the cereal was gone. The waxy paper inside those cardboard boxes was peeled out, wiped clean, and folded for reuse. It lined cake pans, wrapped sandwiches, and separated burger patties in the freezer. Some families used it to roll out pie crusts or knead bread. Others used it to cover dishes or press into the corners of a butter mold. It was sturdy, food-safe, and free. Long before wax paper came on a roll, this was how you managed in the kitchen without waste. The plastic revolution made us forget how versatile a cereal box could be. Grocery stores now sell entire boxes of waxed sheets. But back then, one cereal liner could do the job just as well. It was reuse by instinct, and it made every meal feel just a little more thoughtful. Evaporated milk whipped cream was the sort of dessert trick passed between neighbors, not down through cookbooks. When cream was too expensive or just plain missing from the fridge, you reached for that dented can of evaporated milk in the back of the cupboard. You chilled it until it was ice cold, sometimes freezing it for 10 minutes, and then beat it with a whisk or mixer until it fluffed up. If you added a little sugar and a drop of vanilla, you almost could not tell the difference. It would not hold shape as long as the real thing, but it made a bowl of canned peaches or gelatin salad feel like a special treat. Children did not care if it came from a cow or a can. If it looked creamy, that was enough. You could even fold it into puddings or layer it in trifles. The trick was to keep everything cold and to know when to stop mixing. Today's cookbooks skip this entirely. They assume everyone has heavy cream or will just buy whipped topping. But the old way worked just fine, and it felt like magic every time it turned out right. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Cornflake coating for fried foods was one of those budget miracles that came out of a box. When breadcrumbs were scarce or you just wanted something different, people turned to cornflakes, those same flakes they poured in a bowl for breakfast each morning. Crushed into fine crumbs and tossed with a little salt or paprika, cornflakes made a crunchy, golden coating that worked on everything from chicken to pork chops to fish sticks. You did not need a deep fryer either, just a baking tray, a little oil, and a hot oven. Some versions used a milk and egg wash first, while others went straight from the cornflake crumbs to the pan. The coating crisped up quickly and stayed put, giving each bite a satisfying crunch. This trick was especially common in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience met creativity and boxed cereals found their way into more than just the breakfast table. Kids loved it, adults called it clever, and it quietly became one of the best shortcuts in the American kitchen. Even gluten-free folks today still swear by it. The box said breakfast, but old cookbooks knew better. Before lemon juice became the go-to, vinegar was the silent hero in every kitchen. A quick dip in diluted vinegar water could keep apple slices, pear wedges, or even peeled potatoes from browning too fast. This was especially handy when prepping ahead of time or packing lunch for school and work. The acid slowed down the oxidation process and bought you a few extra hours of freshness without needing plastic wrap or chemical sprays. For households that only had one apple left for the kids, this trick was worth its weight in gold. It made every bit stretch a little further, taste a little better, and last a little longer. Plus, vinegar was cheaper, more common, and already used for dozens of other kitchen needs: cleaning, pickling, preserving. Grocery stores do not want you to know that a bottle of vinegar can outdo half their produce-saving products. But this tiny trick gave families an edge, especially when the fruit bowl was running low and every slice had to count. It was not just thrifty, it was smart. And it is exactly the kind of thing we should be teaching again. Pan-toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying, or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Beet green stir-fry was a shining example of how the 1930s turned scraps into sustenance. When you bought or harvested beets, the leafy tops were never discarded, they were cooked. In fact, they were often more valuable than the beet itself. Families would wash them carefully, chop them up, and saute them in bacon grease, lard, or whatever fat they had. Add a sprinkle of salt or a bit of vinegar, and you had a side dish that tasted far better than its humble roots. The greens were full of nutrients and gave meals color and texture. In cities and rural homes alike, people grew beets in small plots, and nothing was allowed to go to waste. These greens cooked quickly, wilted down, and took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them in. Served alongside potatoes, beans, or cornbread, they added just enough brightness to break up the monotony. It was not fancy, it was smart. Beet greens helped families stretch their gardens, their groceries, and their budgets. You might not miss them now, but back then, they made the difference between a plate that looked full and one that looked empty. Soda pop in cake batter sounds like a kid's prank, but for decades it was a real kitchen trick, and one that actually worked. When families were short on eggs, butter, or milk, they found that a can of cola or lemon-lime soda added not just sweetness, but airiness to boxed cake mixes. The bubbles acted like a leavening agent, giving the batter a lift and a fluffiness that surprised even skeptical bakers. Lemon lime soda went into yellow cakes and cupcakes, while cola paired beautifully with chocolate. The result was a moist, tender crumb that needed no buttercream to be good. Sometimes people would even mix flavored gelatin powder into the batter to amp up the color and make it match the soda. Bright pink for strawberry soda, green for lime, orange for, well, orange. It was part dessert, part science experiment, and always a hit at potlucks and school parties. You would find versions of this in cookbooks with titles like Fun with Cake Mixes or Desserts for a Crowd. Even today, some bakers swear it is the fastest way to get a light, fluffy cake without worrying about what is in the fridge. And they are not wrong. When cereal went stale or no one wanted the crumbs at the bottom of the box, old cooks had a better plan. They baked with it. Cornflakes, bran flakes, even puffed rice were crushed and mixed into muffins, meatloaf, and casseroles. The cereal added texture, absorbed flavor, and helped stretch the main ingredients. In a meatloaf, it soaked up fat and gave it body. In muffins, it acted like flour, turning leftovers into something golden and crisp around the edges. Nothing got tossed. Every scrap had a second life, especially if it saved a little money on flour or breadcrumbs. Grocery stores never advertised this trick because using what you already had meant you were not buying more. But mothers and grandmothers knew better. They turned stale cereal into something warm and filling. You might not even notice it was there, and that was the point. This was cooking with your eyes open and your pantry nearly empty. No fancy boxes, no artificial flavors, just quiet thrift, baked right into dinner. Old coffee reboil with eggshells was a second chance in a cup. When fresh coffee grounds were scarce or when no one could afford to waste them, you would reuse the old grounds with a little twist. You cracked an eggshell into the pot before boiling. The shell helped settle the grit and bitterness, giving the brew a smoother, clearer taste. Sometimes you added a splash of cold water at the end to help the grounds sink even further. The result was not gourmet, but it was strong, hot, and clean. It got you through another morning. People called it cowboy coffee or camp coffee, but it was just what folks did when the tin of beans was running low. It taught you how to make something better with what little you had left. You will not find this on a fancy cafe menu. But for a long time, it was how real people started their day. Sweet potato pie without eggs was a testament to how much flavor could be pulled from so little. Eggs were expensive, milk was scarce, and sugar had to be stretched, but sweet potatoes were dependable. You could bake them, mash them, and mix them with a bit of flour, spices, and molasses to create a smooth filling that held together without help. The crust was optional, and in many homes it was skipped entirely to save flour and fat. The pie was poured into a greased tin and baked until it firmed at the edges and browned just slightly on top. It was soft, earthy, and just sweet enough to count as dessert. Sometimes people would add a dab of butter or a splash of vinegar to deepen the flavor. You did not need whipped cream or toppings. This was comfort on its own. It tasted like autumn, like Sunday dinner, like something you made from scratch and with care. Sweet potato pie was not about presentation. It was about getting a little joy out of the root vegetables you had on hand. And back then, that joy meant everything. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Back before you could buy gravy in a packet or roux in a jar, you had to make it from scratch. That meant browning your own flour. You would pour it into a dry skillet and stir it over medium heat until it turned golden brown, releasing a nutty aroma that meant flavor was on its way. It took time and a bit of practice not to burn it, but the payoff was real. Once cooled, it could be stored in a jar and used to thicken stews, gravies, or creamy casseroles on the fly. This little bit of prep ahead of time made everyday cooking quicker, especially when you had hungry mouths and only 30 minutes to get dinner on the table. Browning flour added richness to even the simplest dishes. No meat? No problem. With a few vegetables and some browned flour, you could still get something satisfying. It is the kind of trick that gives a plain pot of food that slow-cooked flavor without hours of work. But it has faded from our kitchens, probably because supermarkets do not sell it pre-browned. Funny how that works, right? Boiled apple core pectin for jams was a brilliant example of how nothing went to waste, not even the parts most of us toss. When you peeled apples for pies, sauces, or snacks, you saved the cores and skins in a pot. Add water, bring it to a boil, and simmer it down until it became thick and sticky. That cloudy, pale liquid was pure pectin, the natural thickener that made your jams and jellies set without extra sugar or gelatin. You strained it through a cloth and saved it in jars, ready to add to the next batch of strawberry preserves or grape jelly. This trick gave structure to homemade spreads and let families stretch their fruit harvest further. It also meant that one bag of apples could serve 3 or 4 purposes, not just one. Store-bought pectin became popular later, but for many years, this was the only kind you had. The trick worked best with tart apples, especially those a little underripe. It is barely mentioned now, but it was once as essential as sugar itself in rural kitchens. Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then, it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, people found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific molds for specific meals. Rings, domes, fish shapes, you name it. It may not have always tasted great, but it looked impressive. And that counted for something. Somewhere between waste, not, and show-off, gelatin found its niche. Plain boiled wheat berries were a dish that reminded people just how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Wheat berries are whole, unprocessed kernels of wheat that take a long time to cook and an even longer time to chew. But during the Depression, they were affordable, full of fiber, and could be bought in bulk. Families would boil them for hours, softening them just enough to be spooned into bowls like porridge. Sometimes a bit of salt or molasses was added, but most of the time it was just grain and water. The texture was dense, almost nutty, and the feeling of fullness lasted longer than most other meals. It was common on farms and in rural communities where wheat was grown or traded directly. The simplicity of it made it reliable, and when paired with a piece of bread or a spoonful of jam, it could pass as breakfast or dinner. Some families toasted leftover wheat berries to reuse in stews or baked them into loaves. No part of the grain was wasted, and no meal was taken for granted. This was not food for pleasure. It was food for survival. Poking cakes with forks and pouring syrup over the top was not a gimmick. It was a rescue mission. Sometimes a cake came out too dry, or the sugar ratio was off, or the oven ran a little hot. But instead of throwing it away, you saved it. A simple syrup of water and sugar, maybe with a splash of lemon or a dash of cinnamon, was poured into the holes and soaked deep into the crumb. What came out was moist, flavorful, and better than it had started. Long before boxed poke cakes became trendy, this was just what smart bakers did. No one called it anything special. It was just part of knowing your way around the kitchen. This trick gave second chances to cakes that otherwise would not get eaten. Grocery shelves now sell syrups and mixes for the same effect, but the original was simpler, cheaper, and made with intention. Cast iron lid baking was born out of necessity and kept alive by sheer determination. When families had no access to an oven, or when it was too hot to fire one up, they made do with what they had. And what they had was a heavy cast iron pot, usually with a domed lid. Flip that lid over, set it on a flame, and you had a perfectly usable griddle surface for baking bannock, soda bread, or flat cakes. Some folks even propped up the lid with bricks and piled coals on top to create an improvised oven. It took practice to keep the heat even, but the reward was hot bread on a day you thought there would be none. This method showed up in everything from log cabins to war kitchens, and it never let people down. Cast iron held heat like nothing else, and when times got tough, it doubled as bakeware, skillet, and roasting pan. The lid was more than a cover, it was a secret weapon. These tricks rarely appear in modern books, but they kept people fed for generations. Confess which of Grandma's secrets you still use, smash that like button, and subscribe before the big stores send someone to check your pantry.